Hi, Dr. P here to talk about the practical versus reality in game design. Now, this is especially of interest to wargame designers, but anyone who's designing a game that's a simulation or historical based on reality has to face this fundamental question. Now, we all know games can be entirely abstract and have no connection with reality, like checkers. Or there can be models of something or even simulations. Hardly any game is purely one or the other, although checkers looks pretty purely abstract to me. When you're trying to make a model, you still have to simplify reality. That's the nature of models. So you're often forced to face a decision. Will you do or use the practical thing that works for the game, or the realistic thing that better represents reality? What are you going to do? Remember, reality and games are not only separate, they are very different. They're intentionally different. Reality is chaotic. Chance plays a great part in life, in your job, your relationships, your health, etc. Games, when played seriously, I'm not talking about party games or family games, are about player control and often about avoidance of uncertainty and randomness. So these are opposites. When you're making a model, which will prevail, the game or the reality? Examples of taking it easy, letting the game prevail. World of Warships. When you collide with a friendly ship, it causes almost no damage. But when you collide with an enemy ship, you can destroy it and you might destroy yourself. Why? Because the players like it better. In World of Warships, running aground is a minor delay. In the real world, it's a life-threatening disaster. Why the difference? Because players frequently run aground, and the designers of the game don't want to punish them too much for it because they'll become frustrated. And it doesn't have much to do with actually fighting the enemy. So the players are allowed to focus on shooting the enemy and not worrying about killing themselves or their teammates. This helps them avoid loss of control. Another example from World of Tanks. The tracks on vehicles are back up in a few seconds when they're damaged. In the real world, it took at least an hour, but sometimes days. Why this difference? Well, track hits are pretty common, and no one wants to be immobilized by such a simple thing. Modern players hate to lose even one turn, and evidently in World of Tanks they hate to lose more than a few seconds when they can't move. In both World of Tanks and World of Warships, you can shoot accurately at something that's been spotted by a teammate, even though foliage or smoke or even an island prevents you from seeing it. Now, in the real world, there's no way that somebody can describe where something is sufficiently to you that you can shoot it without seeing it, but in the games it happens all the time and it's easy. Now, sometimes this sort of thing is absolutely required. For example, in role-playing games, levels are necessary for role-playing games, and difficulty levels are really important in general for video games. They may be free-form or they may be enforced so that you simply cannot go where you're not supposed to go, as in The Division. If you're going to have a game with a wide variety of player capabilities, and the whole point in RPGs is for players to start as novices and become somewhere between powerful and superhuman, then you have to have difficulty levels and player levels of the equivalent. You don't want the new weak characters to be tangling with adult dragons or with something else that'll just wipe them out, swat them aside. Get out of town, kid. You want people to meet reasonable challenges. Games work that way. People enjoy games when the challenge is neither too easy nor too hard. So difficulty level lets players find their comfort zone, and the levels in RPGs let players do things that are appropriate to their current level of power. This lets the player feel that they're in control. Now, the practical choice can drastically change the game and take it far from reality. For example, that business about spotting and being behind cover in World of Warships. The result is that smoke screens are used entirely differently than in real life. The purpose of a smoke screen in World War II was to prevent the enemy from seeing you so they couldn't shoot at you. But you couldn't shoot at them because the smoke screen was in the way. In World of Warships, because somebody else can spot for you, you can use the smoke screens like hunters' blinds, hunters of deer, for example. And it lets them, the players who are in the smoke screen, shoot accurately without being targeted. Completely unrealistic. So in the end, the consequences of these practical choices make player behavior in virtually all games, especially tactical warfare games, far different than real-world behavior. And of course, if you think about it, nowadays, in most movies and TV shows too, people do things that are just not anywhere near reality. And that's why commercial games cannot really let you try historical what-ifs, because there's so little real connection with reality. Now, there are big assumptions, things that change everything, that make the game better, though the model worse. And if these are clear from the outset, then players get to decide whether they want to accept them or not. If they don't play the game. If they do, then they accept ridiculous details of cause and effect that result. For example, in XCOM 2, the video game, the player's flying transport vehicle can hover right next to an enemy flying transport vehicle, both lowering or recovering people without any interaction. It makes no sense at all. The time limits are purely arbitrary. And when the going gets really tough late in the game, suddenly you can only have 3 people in your attacking party instead of 6. Why? It makes no sense except to make it more difficult. Now, abstractions are inevitable in games because reality is much too complex for even the most photorealistic game. Somebody said, for models you need an idealist, not a realist, because only idealists can break things down to their simple components. On the other hand, you'd think that cause and effect needed to be respected. But in some video games especially, and in a lot of tabletop games too, it doesn't seem to be respected. Now, what you can't do, I think, is mess with cause and effect on the fly, because that's always jarring. It takes people out of the game. If they know it's going to be that way from the start, that's one thing. If it suddenly happens and there's no explanation for it, then it removes the immersion. And will make a separate screencast, The Failure of Cause and Effect, to talk more about this. So each designer, and for that matter, each individual game design, has its own comfort level. There's no stock answer as to where you should be, although you have to consider what will your audience accept. What does your audience think about this? That is very important. Thanks for listening.